Some confessions are meant to stay buried, and some voices should never be answered. Liam had restored dozens of old buildings in his 20-year career as a carpenter. But St. Bartholomew's Church felt different from the moment he stepped inside. The building had been abandoned for over 40 years. Its congregation, long dispersed after a fire, claimed the original sanctuary. The insurance settlement had finally come through, and the new owners wanted the interior restored to its former glory. A confessional booth stood in the far corner of the nave, a case dark but somehow untouched by the decades of neglect that had warped the pews and buckled the floorboards. Liam's job was simple: sand down the surfaces, replace the rotted sections, and restore the intricate carvings that decorated the booth's exterior. It should have taken 3 days, maybe 4. On the first morning, Liam set up his tools and began examining the booth structure. The whispers had grown more insistent throughout the day, and he'd caught himself straining to hear them whenever he paused his work. The whispers were clearer here, multiple voices overlapping in urgent, breathless confession. He could almost make out words fragments about guilt and darkness and things that should never have been done. There was something about their rhythm that pulled at him, a desperation that made his chest tight. Liam's hands trembled as he pressed closer to the wall. The voices seemed to be coming from impossibly far away, as if the confessional opened onto some vast, echoing space rather than the small priest's compartment he'd been working in all week. The priest's side was in remarkably good condition, but the penitent's compartment showed signs of damaged, long scratches gouged into the wood, as if someone had clawed desperately at the walls. He'd locked the church himself when he arrived that morning, and he had the only key. The kneeler was worn smooth in the center, polished by countless knees seeking absolution. Liam caught fragments. Shouldn't have done it. ... Never meant to. ... Forgive me, please. The desperation in those voices made his throat constrict. As he worked, sanding away decades of grime, Liam became aware of the building's sounds. Every secret they thought they could leave behind in this booth, and when they were done, when they walked away thinking themselves cleansed, ... I followed them home. Old wood settled and creaked. Wind whistled through gaps in the boarded windows. It wasn't air, it was whispering, faint, desperate, almost musical in its cadence, like a prayer spoken too quietly to understand. The man who struck that child with his car and drove a wire road with him for months, whispering the boy's name in his ear. The priest who did unspeakable things to the children in his caring, made sure he heard their cries until the day he died. Every secret that should have died with them. And now, a sound like laughter, but wrong, broken. Now, you've heard them too. But underneath these familiar noises, he began to notice something else, soft, susurrus, that seemed to emanate from within the confessional itself. At first, he dismissed it as air moving through the building's ventilation system. But by the second day, the sound had grown more distinct. Liam checked the building's blueprints. No ventilation ran through that section of the church. The church seemed to pulse around him, the walls breathing with collected guilt and whispered sins. He ran for the door, fumbling with the locks, the terrible voice following him. At times, late at night, neighbors report hearing whispers drifting from the abandoned building, desperate voices seeking absolution that will never come, and one deeper voice, patient and eternal, listening to them all. Perhaps the wood itself had absorbed their confessions, their guilt soaking into the grain like blood into earth. He examined the booth's construction, looking for hollow spaces or hidden passages. Nothing. The whispers continued, always from the penitent's side, always just below the threshold of comprehension. On the third evening, as autumn darkness crept through the boarded windows, Liam found himself lingering in the church longer than usual. Then, from the darkness of the priest's side, came a new voice. Deep, guttural, nothing like the desperate whispers that had preceded it. He knelt on the penitent's side, pressing his ear to the wall where the sounds seemed strongest. Hello? he called softly into the booth. The whispers stopped. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, then resumed with doubled intensity. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he could hear his own breathing echoed back from the other side, distorted and strange. But he was alone. "What are you saying?" he whispered. The voices grew more frantic, overlapping until they became a wall of desperate sound. He thought of all the people who had knelt in this very spot over the decades, murderers, thieves, adulterers, all seeking absolution for their sins. "What have you done?" he whispered back, half mocking, half curious. The whispers cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence, Liam heard his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "I listened to them all," it said, each word clear as a bell in the empty church. Every confession, every sign. Liam's blood turned to ice. The voice continued, patient and terrible. "The woman who poisoned her husband, I watched her sleep every night after, standing at the foot of her bed." The voice grew closer, as if the speaker had pressed his mouth against a screen that separated the two compartments. "You want to know what I've done, Liam? I've carried their sins for 40 years. Every confession that should have stayed buried. Liam stumbled backward, his tools clattering to the floor. "Kay, you can't unhear them now, Liam. They're yours to carry. It's just like they were mine." Liam never returned to finish the restoration. The church sits empty still, its confessional booth waiting in the shadows. Some sounds are meant to stay buried in stone. Chloe learned this the hard way. Chloe had always been drawn to forgotten places. There was something magnetic about abandoned buildings. The way shadows pooled in corners where light once danced, the stories whispered by peeling paint and broken glass. Built in 1887, it had housed the Order of Silent Sisters for nearly a century before closing in 1982 under mysterious circumstances. Local records were sparse, mentioning only that the remaining nuns had been relocated to other facilities. No one spoke of what had happened in those final months. In what had once been the chapel, wooden pews sat in crooked rows, facing an altar where a massive crucifix hung at an unnatural angle. Everything felt abandoned, forgotten, but not quite dead. The corridor was darker than the rest of the convent, her flashlight beam seeming to weaken as it penetrated the gloom. The walls here were different turf, older stone that felt damp to the touch. But the Convent of Silent Sisters was different from our usual urban exploration targets. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made it impossible to locate the source. This place felt heavy, as if the very air had weight. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Chloe's hand trembled as she pushed it open. The walls of the narrow corridor were covered floor to ceiling with tally marks, thousands upon thousands of them carved deep into the stone. They overlapped and intersected, creating a manic tapestry of scratches. Some marks were fresh and deep, while others had been worn smooth by time. It was the soft, rhythmic scraping of fingernails against stone, coming from inside the wall itself. Scritch, scritch, patient, methodical, counting in places. The stone had been carved away entirely, leaving ragged gouges. The sound followed her, growing louder, more insistent. That night, lying in bed, she could swear she heard it, the soft, patient scratching of fingernails on stone. And in her dreams, she saw tally marks carved into her bedroom walls, counting down to something she didn't want to understand. Behind her, the scratching continued, growing fainter, but never stopping. She burst through the wooden door, slammed it shut, and didn't stop running until she reached her car. The sounds joined it, more scratching from different locations within the walls. And she wonders what the sisters were counting all those years, locked away in their walls of stone in silence. In one of the upper windows, a pale shape moved just for a moment before disappearing back into the darkness. A symphony of fingernails on stone, all keeping the same steady rhythm. She started to back away, but her light caught something that froze her in place. At the far end of the corridor, barely visible in the gloom, Fresh tally marks covered a section of wall that seemed different from the rest. It looked newer, like it had been bricked up. The convent sat perched on a hill outside Millbrook, its Gothic spires clawing at the October sky. Chloe parked her car at the base of the hill. Shouldering her backpack filled with cameras, flashlights, and emergency supplies, the tally marks at eye level were old, weathered, but the ones near the floor were fresh, the stone dust still pale around their edges. And they continued down the hallway, growing denser with each step. Chloe's flashlight beam wavered as her hands shook. The marks weren't random, they were organized. Groups of 5, just like prison tally marks, counting something. But counting what? Rats, she told herself. Old buildings were full of them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown path leading to the convent's entrance. Dead leaves crunched beneath her boots as she climbed, each step bringing the imposing structure closer. The main door hung askew on rusted hinges. Chloe slipped through the gap, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The entrance hall stretched before her, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through broken stained glass windows, and the air tasted of mold and something else, something sour and old. Her footsteps echoed as she explored the main wing. Empty dormitories lined the corridors, their doorways gaping like mouths. It was in the refectory that Chloe first heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on stone. She paused, listening, but the sound stopped. Behind the refectory, Chloe discovered a narrow hallway she hadn't noticed on the building's exterior. The scratching started again, more distinct now. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Just rats, Chloe whispered to herself, but her voice sounded thin and unconvincing in the oppressive silence. The hallway ended at a heavy wooden door marked with a small brass plate. Contemplation wing. Authorized personnel only. The space beyond took her breath away, not from beauty, but from horror. The scratching sound was clearer now, a steady scritch, scritch, scritch that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As she stepped deeper into the corridor, Chloe noticed something that made her blood run cold. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Chloe could hear her own ragged breathing and the frantic hammering of her heart. That's when she heard a sound that wasn't scratching at all, but something far worse. Chloe stumbled backward, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the marked walls. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the hallway like gunshots. As she fumbled with her keys, Chloe looked back at the convent. She drove away without looking back, but the sound followed her home. Chloe never returned to the convent of Silent Sisters. But sometimes, on quiet nights, she still hears the scratching. Some sounds, she learned, are meant to stay buried. But once you've heard them, they never really leave you alone. Some discoveries should remain buried, and Dr. Eris Thorne learned this truth when she followed those impossible footprints deeper into the darkness than any living person should ever go. Dr. Eris Thorne had spent 3 weeks mapping the forgotten catacombs beneath St. Bartholomew's Monastery, a crumbling 12th century structure that had been abandoned for over a century. The local historical society had commissioned her work after groundskeepers reported structural concerns about the basement floors. What they expected was a simple survey of burial chambers and foundation integrity. What Eris found was something far more unsettling. The main catacomb network was extensive, but predictable rows of stone alcoves containing the remains of monks, benefactors, and local nobility. Each burial site was meticulously documented in the monastery's surviving records. But on her 18th day underground, Eris discovered a narrow passage that didn't appear on any of the architectural plans she'd studied. The opening was barely wide enough for her shoulders, hidden behind a collapsed section of masonry that looked deliberate rather than accidental. As she worked, she noticed details that sent small shivers down her spine. Some of the stone lids bore traces of scratch marks, as if tiny fingernails had clawed at the inner surfaces. Others had hairline cracks that seemed to spread outward from within. Her lantern light revealed rough-hewn stone walls that extended into impenetrable darkness, carved in a child's unsteady hand. Emma, age 6, then another. Thomas, age 4, and another. Sarah, age 8. But as she followed the trail, the temperature continued to drop until her breath came out in visible puffs. They echoed slightly in what must be another chamber beyond her vision. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. Like a child walking hesitantly through unfamiliar surroundings. And she could hear something that made her blood turn to ice. The soft sound of bare feet on stone, coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness, but something compelled her Fawuda historian's curiosity, mixed with a growing certainty that she was witnessing something that defied every rational explanation Shidi ever trusted. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but now she could hear something worse. A soft whimpering, like a frightened child calling for help. Its passage opened into yet another chamber, this one filled with the sound of dripping water and something else breathing that wasn't her own. The names continued, each one carved not by a stonemason, but by young hands that had somehow marked their own resting places. The air that drifted from the passage carried a different quality than the rest of the catacombs, not just the expected mustiness of age, but something sweeter and more unsettling. The features were those of a young girl, but the skin was translucent, and on quiet nights, crimekeepers still report hearing the sound of children playing somewhere deep beneath St. Bartholomew's Monastery. Their laughter echoing through stone chambers that official records insist have never existed, and marked with dark veins, and the eyes held a hollow emptiness that spoke of decades spent in the cold earth. In the center of the chamber stood a small figure, no more than 8 years old, wearing the tattered remains of what might once have been a nightgown. Eris whispered, her voice barely audible. The child's back was turned to Eris, and muddy water pooled around bare feet that left the same prints she'd been following. The historical records had mentioned an orphanage connected to the monastery, but it had supposedly closed in 1847 due to a tuberculosis outbreak. These burial chambers suggested something far more extensive and tragic had occurred. Her equipment was scattered, her lantern extinguished, and her documentation incomplete. She claimed no memory of what had happened in the children's section of the crypt, but the monastery sealed the entrance permanently the following week. It's like flowers left too long in stagnant water. A trail of small footprints led from Michael's alcove across the chamber toward a section of wall that disappeared into deeper darkness. The prints were muddy, as if whoever made them had walked through wet earth, leaving dark smears on the ancient stone. At the base of the alcove, pressed into the thin layer of dust and debris that covered the chamber floor, is the clear impression of a small, bare foot. The footprint was fresh, so fresh that the edges were still crisp and undisturbed. But that was impossible. The chamber had been sealed for decades, possibly longer. No child could have made this mark. Unlike the elaborate tombs in the main catacombs, these were simple, unmarked rectangles of weathered stone. The chamber felt different to Calder, despite being deeper underground, filled with an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps. Eris squeezed through the opening, her breathing shallow in the confined space. The passage opened after 20 feet into a circular chamber, unlike anything else she'd encountered in the monastery's depths. The ceiling was lower here, forcing her to hunch as she moved. But what made her pause wasn't the architecture writ, was the size of the burial alcoves. They were tiny, built for children. Her lantern beam swept across dozens of small stone sarcophagi, each no longer than 4 feet. Eris began her documentation methodically, photographing each alcove and taking measurements. It was while photographing the 7th alcove that she found the first name, barely visible. Eris's breath began to fog in the increasingly cold air as she documented name after name. She was photographing the inscription, Michael, age 5, when her lantern light caught something that made her freeze completely. Eris knelt slowly, her hands trembling as she held the lantern closer. She followed the beam of her lantern and found another print, then another. The rational part of Eris's mind cycled through explanations. Maybe a child from the village had discovered another entrance. Maybe the prints were older than they appeared. The footsteps were small, light, but unmistakably real. Eris's training told her to retreat, to document what she'd found, and return with proper equipment and colleagues. The muddy footprints led to an opening in the far wall, another narrow passage that descended at a steep angle. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, Eris followed the trail deeper into the darkness. Her lantern beam swept the space and illuminated a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Hello? The figure turned slowly, and in the flickering lantern light, Eris saw a face that belonged in no world of the living. The child opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, what emerged was the sound of dirt falling into a grave. Dr. Eris Thorne was found 3 days later by a search team, unconscious at the entrance to the narrow passage. The muddy footprints, however, were never explained, and with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you, or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.